By the time this video goes live, we will have just passed the 20th anniversary of one of the greatest detective movies ever. As you have probably figured out by now, I'm talking about Memories of Murder. In the United States, everyone has put Bong Joon-ho on their radar after his 2019 masterpiece, Parasite. While I think Parasite is a superb film, I personally prefer Memories of Murder. I think this film has a lot to offer, and it's honestly a shame that more people haven't seen it. There is so much to talk about when it comes to Memories of Murder, but I'm gonna try to focus on the meaning of the film and offer to you guys my best analysis. After having seen Memories of Murder a grand total of 6 times, I have found the same central message to be repeated throughout the film. That message is all about assumptions and the consequences that come with prejudice. To break down this tackling of assumptions in the film, I'm going to segment this video into different areas. We'll first start with the audience and how the film challenges their assumptions. If you have seen any detective movie before, then you are probably accustomed to the detective being the good guy who can do no wrong. Some films stretch this and make the detective a little more impulsive, but their choices are usually heavily justified, and we can't fault them as the audience. However, there's very few crime movies that I can think of that blatantly put their detectives in the wrong, and have them make choices that are clearly far from acceptable conduct. One of these exceptions is Bong Joon-ho's Memories of Murder. The detectives we get in Memories of Murder are far from your typical movie gumshoes. These detectives, while somewhat relatable, are incredibly ineffective and downright lazy when it comes to their methods. They act out of what's convenient, and when a suspect is brought to them, they vet them out by staring at them and beating them to a false confession. If you know anything about Memories of Murder, then you probably know that it's based on the true story of the first serial killer in South Korea. The Hwasong serial murders were committed between 1986 and 1991, and took the lives of many women in quite a varying age range. What's just as notorious as the killings is the police's handling of the investigation. There were more than 2 million police officers on the case, a record number, and the total number of suspects were roughly 21,000. The police brutally beat and humiliated many of the suspects, and this led to false confessions. And at least 4 of these men even took their own lives after their interrogations. One of these false confessions came from Yoon Sung-yeol, who was falsely imprisoned in 1989. He was in jail for 20 years before a judge overturned his sentence, citing torture tactics used by the police to solicit a confession. In Memories of Murder, we see the police force using these tactics, and they predicate everything off their own prejudice. When they see someone they personally think could be guilty, they try everything in their power to get a confession, even if it goes against having an honest investigation. The detectives make their own assumptions, and so do we as the audience. When we first watch this movie, assuming we don't have the background knowledge of what happened in the Hwasong serial murders, we would think the detectives are supposed to be the good guys. This is the line of thinking I had when I first watched Memories of Murder, since I didn't know about the history behind the movie. But as the film progresses, it becomes very obvious that no one is who they really appear to be. Not the suspects, and not even the police. This is an aspect that really separates and makes Memories of Murder unique, because not many movies show you a flawed but realistic police force. By not giving us the typical righteous protagonists, Memories of Murder challenges us to see the nuances of the case and how there are truly no innocent parties in this film. From here, we'll move on to the police in the film and how their assumptions are characterized. There are 3 detectives in Memories of Murder, and I'm going to refer to them by the nicknames that Cinema Autopsy gives them in his video. That way I can avoid mispronouncing the names and to raise some awareness about his video, since it's really good and I think all of you should watch it. We have 3 detectives: the shaman, named after his eyes and mystical approach, the kicker, pretty self-evident, and the scientist, who gets his name from his more analytical method. One of the many themes present in the film is the idea of the impossibility of justice, and the cops in this movie show us that no investigation is truly impartial or free from internal biases. As much as we would like to think that the cops are diligent and completely objective in their investigations, this simply isn't the case, and we shouldn't hold them to be completely unbiased and fair, because we all have our own internal prejudice. We, just like the cops, expect the killer to be some freak who will stand out from the crowd, but this is usually never the case, especially when it comes to high-profile serial killers. Many notable serial killers like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Russell Williams went under the radar because they seemed quote-unquote normal. In the film, the shaman talks about how his eyes can spot who is guilty and who is innocent, and we see him throughout the movie telling his suspects to look him directly in the eye. And he's so confident in his abilities that he thinks that he can go to a bathhouse and spot the killer immediately from his intuition. His friend and other detective on the case, the kicker, seems to support this ideology, and he thinks that he can beat the truth out of the suspects. It's only when the scientist comes to the investigation that we get a re-evaluation of this method, and we get what seems to be a much more thorough search. The first meeting between the shaman and the scientist also showcases their mentalities. The scientist lacks the social awareness to see what could be wrong with approaching a lone woman in the countryside, where another woman just got brutally raped and murdered. The woman he approaches is obviously on full alert, but also falsely assumes that the scientist is the killer himself, and this leads to the shaman confronting him as a possible suspect. The shaman immediately charges the scientist and arrests him, so much for his eyes being able to spot the guilty from the innocent. Notice how in this scene, there are assumptions made from all 3 present characters, and these assumptions have immediate consequences. The scientist assumes that he can walk up to a woman walking alone in the countryside where a crime just happened, and there's nothing wrong or off-putting about that. The woman he approaches immediately assumes that he's out to get her and that he means harm. The shaman sees what unfolds and assumes that the scientist's actions indicate malice instead of stupidity. This small scene shows us how everyone has built-in assumptions and how those assumptions have consequences, and this carries on to the narrative and the rest of the film. Going back to the police, the shaman believes in folk wisdom, and he thinks that with enough walking around, they'll eventually catch the killer. His old suspicions lead him to consulting a fortune teller, and when his female secretary approaches him and offers a lead, he completely dismisses her, because he assumes that she won't have anything useful because of the age-old stereotype that women in law enforcement are less effective than men. The scientist is really the only detective to challenge the shaman and the kicker. When the shaman is dismissing leads due to his sexism, the scientist is following through on them. When the shaman and the kicker are beating the suspects, instead of listening to what they have to say, the scientist is paying close attention and locating the sources of their words, leading to the discoveries of new leads. When the shaman is planting fake evidence to use in his investigation, the scientist is digging through the paperwork to find the truth. When the shaman and the kicker are able to convince their own suspects that they are guilty, the scientist finds the truth and proves their innocence. When the others are partying and getting drunk, the scientist is reflecting on the case and brainstorming new ideas. We can even see how the scientist is always separated from the other 2 cops. There's one scene in the film that encapsulates these conflicting mentalities perfectly, and this happens in the family restaurant of the first suspect. During this scene, there is a comedic moment in which the shaman gives the first suspect a pair of sneakers as a sort of compensation for his troubles. The same troubles that almost got him jailed for life, if not sentenced to death. The scientist is quick to point out that these sneakers are not genuine Nikes as the shaman claims, but rather rip-offs that instead say Nices. The shaman responds by saying who cares, it's close enough, and then the scientist replies that if you get somebody sneakers, you should at least get them the real thing. This might seem like a small interaction, but it really does say a lot about their characters. For the shaman, finding the real thing isn't as important when you can easily find a substitution. This is why he goes after false leads, because for him they suffice since he doesn't need the real thing. On the other hand, for a detail-oriented man like the scientist, he needs to know whether he has the original, and therefore he can't go after a lead unless he knows it to be true. The kicker chimes in by completely ignoring the debate and instead telling the first suspect that the beatings are an act of love and to not be shy if he sees him in public. The kicker's comments show how he is too caught up in his emotions to pay attention to the topic at hand. This mentality carries over to his approach, where he seems to be too caught up in his anger to objectively assess whether someone is truly guilty. This scene serves as a precursor for what's to come, and it perfectly depicts the conflicting approaches of all three detectives. If you're familiar with Bong Joon-ho movies, then you have probably picked up on the fact that he loves to use motifs and peculiar objects as symbolic tools. In Okja, it's the golden pig. In Parasite, it's the rock that turns out to be hollow. In Snowpiercer, it's the arms. And in Memories of Murder, it's the rip-off sneaker. We see the shoes come back into play when the detectives go to question the first suspect about what he saw that night. The first suspect runs away and claims that the cops are going to kill him, because for him, the cops and the killer are one and the same. Going back to the shoe, the killer is the original Nike, whereas the police are the rip-off variant, but functionally they are the same. Once the first suspect is run over by a train, the only artifact that the shaman has left to remember him by is his shoe. The shaman stares at the shoe almost as a cathartic moment of realization. I mentioned some of this before, but just to reiterate, each of the three cops seem to have their own assumptions heading into this investigation. The shaman believes that he can identify the killer just by looking into their eyes. The kicker thinks that with enough beatings, they'll find the killer. And the scientist believes that with enough sifting through the paperwork, he's guaranteed to find the truth. All of these assumptions backfire in the film, and we see all of the cops do a complete 180. And with this in mind, let's move on to our third section, the aftermath of assumptions. Let's start with the consequences for the police. Each detective in the movie gets directly challenged by their own philosophy. The kicker realizes that violence doesn't lead to the truth, and he is shown what the outcomes of violence can be. The shaman finally meets his match and admits his ignorance, and the scientist seems to have all the indications to point towards a suspect being guilty until his own method of finding the truth in the paperwork comes back to bite him in the rear. With the shaman and the scientist, it's very interesting to see how their characters flip towards the end of the movie. For the bulk of the film, it's the shaman who uses his eyes as the judge and jury for determining whether someone is guilty. For him, the ends justify the means, and since he believes he already knows the end result through his mystical eyes, it justifies his behavior to frame suspects since they are, for him, truly guilty anyway. The scientist is the opposite of this, with the means leading to the end as they should. But towards the end of the movie, him and the shaman switch perspectives. For the scientist, the third suspect is without a doubt the one they have been looking for, and so going about on more sketchy means to get him jailed is acceptable since the end is already decided. We can see this switch in perspectives in both of the detectives' actions. The scientist was the one who would keep the cops from beating others during their questioning, but in the end, it's the scientist who uses violence to scold the suspects and to let out his frustration. The one who actually has to be restrained is the scientist, as the shaman keeps him from landing his shots at the accused. The scientist's philosophy of finding the truth in the paperwork is completely discarded by him, and he calls the DNA results a lie. This is in complete contrast with his character earlier in the film, where he kept his personal bias away from his investigation. The detective who grows the most is actually the shaman, who finally admits that his philosophy is wrong and that he can't find the truth from looking into someone's eyes. However, what's more interesting than the aftermath for the detectives is the aftermath for the suspects, or should I say, victims. Each suspect who is interrogated in the film is left in a state that mirrors the victims of the serial killer. Let's start with the first suspect. We see him surrounded by children, and this indicates his mental capacity and how he is still just a kid. The killer isn't afraid to go after kids, and neither are the cops. The cops lure him, give him a false sense of security, and then strip him down and beat him, before binding his hands and taking him out to a field. This is roughly the same process that the serial killer went through, as his only child victim is found in the wilderness with her hands and feet tied. The second suspect is found when he goes away from his home, and he wears red underwear, which is why he is chosen by the cops. The killer also likes to target individuals who are away from their home and who wear red. Both the cops and the killer hide in the grass when they hunt their soon-to-be victims. The third and final suspect is dragged away from his house and taken to a tunnel where he is meant to suffer the same fate that we see for the first victim in the film. It's in the darkest and most secluded places where the killer and the cops like to do their dirty work, with both of them disposing of their victims in underpasses far away from the public. We find out in the film that the killer only strikes on days when it rains, and what's happening during this scene with the cops and the final suspect? It's raining. I also want to spend a little more time on this scene because so much of its substance tends to go unrecognized. If you paid attention during Parasite, then you know that Bong Joon-ho loves to use lines in his shots. He uses these lines in Memories of Murder as well. In this scene, the tracks serve as the natural line in the shot, and when the scientist debates about killing the suspect, the lines come into play in displaying his thought process. Initially, when the scientist puts the gun up to the suspect's head but doesn't shoot, he initiates by only putting one foot over the line. This signals that he's still iffy about whether or not he wants to kill the suspect, and he isn't fully willing to commit just yet. Once this hesitation is gone, and he decides to kill the suspect, he runs over the line and begins shooting, which shows how his character has transformed and how he has literally crossed a line when it comes to his morality. Pair this with the fact that we also literally catch the scientist red-handed in this scene. The train track scene for me largely complements the opening of the movie. At the beginning of the film, we see a body in a tunnel, but have no idea how it got there. The train track scene shows us how the police drag an innocent individual out to a tunnel and ruthlessly beat him, before leaving his body to hide away in that same tunnel. There seems to be a parallel between this scene and the opening. The opening shows us the end result, whereas this train track scene shows us how we got there. There's also another tie that links this scene to the beginning, and this happens when the scientist holds the third suspect at gunpoint and yells at him to say that he killed the girls. The suspect then says that he did, and he asks the scientist if that's what he wanted to hear. Throughout the movie, the cops always torture the suspects and make them repeat the things that they tell them to say. The opening scene of the movie foreshadows how the suspects will parrot what the cops say, and we see this with the kid who keeps on repeating what the cop is saying. The final suspect directly challenges this repetition instead of falling for it. There's also the recurring element of trains that once again appears in this scene. The train comes through and runs over what little evidence the cops had, just like it did before with the first suspect's death. I also think this ties back to the fake shoe in that the cops are left with a look-alike. They have a suspect they can pin the blame on, but they both know he's not the real deal. It's clear to me that this film wants to illustrate that both the serial killer and the cops are monsters, with one striking at night while the other strikes in the day. The parallels between their victims is only further confirmation that both of them are killers, with each party leaving its victims either as social outcasts or deceased in the most humiliating of ways. We can see this ostracization very subtly presented in the train track scene with the last suspect. After his beating, the last suspect walks into the tunnel, which hints at the fact that he'll have to live his life out in isolation, as he can't trust those around him, even the authorities. Bong Joon-ho could have easily chosen to make him walk the way he came when he's done with the police, and this would be the natural choice for his character, as he probably wants to walk back home. But instead, Bong makes him walk into the tunnel, and this is clearly done to draw that parallel between him and the first victim we see in the film, but to also show that he's now a social outcast who doesn't want to show his face around others. He was an innocent bystander who was tortured, humiliated, and now he feels estranged from society. This is the exact same outcome for the woman on the hill, who was a victim of the serial killer. When we think back to the real-life case, many of the suspects felt humiliated and ashamed, and subsequently became black sheeps amongst a paranoid Korea. I think this aspect of the film, with both the killer and the cops leaving their victims in similar conditions, is very intentional, and this parallel goes criminally unnoticed when talking about this film. When I realized this parallel, I was blown away by the hidden intricacies of the film, and as I've mentioned before, there is no other crime movie that I can think of that does this. Now let's move on to the most talked about part of Memories of Murder, and probably the most genius breaking of the fourth wall I have seen. Of course, I'm talking about the ending. The ending of Memories of Murder may just be my favorite movie ending ever, because it's so simple, yet so powerful. There is no big twist or insane reveal, it's just a few lines of dialogue about somebody who didn't appear to be special in any way. As the little girl says, the stranger she encountered was just ordinary. Before we dive into the assumptions aspect of this scene, I want to discuss the film techniques used here. The majority of Memories of Murder is processed in a way to appear desaturated, and this was done intentionally to add to the grim nature of the film. However, the beginning and end scenes in the fields were processed normally to show off that golden glow, and subsequently, these scenes stand out when compared to the rest of the film. The movie is clearly urging us to pay special attention to these two scenes, and by having the rice field from the beginning stand out with its golden radiance, it makes it so you immediately recognize when the shaman goes back to it. The shaman returning to where he started and repeating the same motion he did 17 years prior shows that after all this time, he is right back to where he started, literally. The camera goes painfully slow as it reveals that the tunnel is in fact empty. The duality of the police and the killer is also further emphasized here, with both eluding punishment for their wrongdoings and coming back to a place they hold deep in their hearts to reminisce about their past lives. The killer gets off scotch-free, and the shaman is able to live out his days as a salaryman, probably making more money than he did as a cop. The girl who approaches the shaman says that the man she encountered a few days ago was doing the same exact thing as him, and this further underscores the similarities between the killer and the police. This scene has superb writing, and the form really follows the function. But now let's get to the last few seconds of the film in which the shaman stares directly at the camera. The message of this gesture is twofold from my understanding. The first meaning behind why the shaman stares is to show how anyone in the audience could be a killer while appearing to be quote-unquote normal. The second and more substantial message is the remembrance of the murders. And this brings us to the director's assumption. Bong Joon-ho assumes that the killer will return to watch the film, to bask in his glory, since, as the film tells us, the criminal always returns to the crime scene. An assumption that turned out to be true. The real killer confessed to his crimes in 2019. When asked if he saw the movie, he said that he did and that he felt no strong emotions toward it. While Memories of Murder ends on a sad note with no clear answer, it's somewhat bittersweet to know that the true killer came forward and finally confessed to the killings. I say bittersweet because the lives of those women can't come back and the damage from the police is there to stay. But there was ultimately still judicial justice for the killer, albeit delayed. On the surface, Memories of Murder is a historical piece documenting the Hwasong serial murders, but once we look closer, we find a much more nuanced film that sheds light about violence and how it isn't just exclusive to classified criminals. This film resonates with anybody who has dealt with an unsolved murder, or really any heinous crime that left the victim without any answers. Just as Bong Joon-ho will never forget the murders that shook Korea, I will never forget his film that shook me. Well, that's all I have for this video. Please let me know your thoughts over Memories of Murder in the comments below. This video specifically took a long ass time to make, so if you could help me out by clicking the like button and commenting to help with the chances of this video being seen, that would really mean a lot to me. I will also link some other Memories of Murder videos I have watched in the description below that I think are absolutely amazing, so check those out if you want some more analysis of this incredible film. Anyways, that's all I have. If you made it this far, thank you, I love you, and I genuinely hope that you have a great rest of your day.